Hello and welcome to History Respawned. This is John Harney, and I'm joined today by Bob. Hey, Bob.
Hey, John. How are you?
I am good, thanks. Bob, as you know, the agenda today is driven primarily by my need, my desire, my irrefutable desire to discuss Crusader Kings III, the sequel to my favorite game of all time, which was Crusader Kings II.
Good. Let's hear about it.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Crusader Kings III. I'm just going to jump right into it. We'll later on we'll get into what's coming up on the History Respawn website and channel and stuff later. So Crusader Kings III came out. It came out this past Tuesday evening in Europe, lunchtime in the US, and I don't know what to tell. Crusader Kings III is really good. So it's this very strange game in the sense that it's kind of just Crusader Kings 2, except it's very pretty and it's so much more welcoming and it's just so much more inviting. So it's still a weird, grognardy, complicated game. But whereas I got into Crusader Kings 2 by finding a 7-page forum post about a guy who managed to turn a family from the city of Limerick, which is where I'm from, into a massive empire controlling North Africa. And that's how I learned to play Crusader Kings 2. The game now does that in a tutorial, which I'm guessing if you'd never played a Paradox game would take about 20 minutes. And there's definitely moments where you're like, wait, what? If you've never played a Paradox game. But it shows you, hey, this is who you are. This is how traits work. This is what you should do. Here's how to find someone to marry your offspring to. Here's how to wage a war. Have fun. And like there's more to the game, but it talks you through the basic stuff. The UI is vastly superior to what it used to be. And they've added, this was kind of there in Crusader Kings 2 DLC, but they've added this kind of leveling up process, kind of borrowed from other Paradox games like Hearts of Iron. And so this is as smooth. If anybody was interested in getting into one of these big strategy games, CK3 is your best chance yet. And I haven't played enough of it yet to really get into this, but I'm pretty sure that before too long I'll discover this is CK2 but prettier and easier is unfair. I think there's definitely more to it. I haven't really got there yet. But they've definitely kept the same odd, dark sense of humor. So as I tweeted the other day, I ended up in a situation where far and away the most sensible thing for me to do to proceed well in the game was to marry my granddaughter to her uncle, my nephew. And I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And so that's kind of an early taste of, and people are having affairs and bishops are getting diseases they shouldn't technically be able to get. So all the good things are happening. There it is. John Harney's Crusader Kings 3 review.
All right. People thanks for joining us on this episode of History Respawn. Now that all sounds really promising. Crusader Kings 2 is a game that I played for, I would guess about 5 to 6 hours. It wasn't really my jam. I was much more interested in Europa Universalis and Hearts of Iron. But Crusader Kings is just not really my thing. But I am interested in this game primarily because of what you mentioned, this kind of smoothed out, what you might call onboarding process for getting players up to speed about what to expect, what kinds of shenanigans you can get up to. And, it sounds like, from listening to you and from, reading early reviews of the game, that this is a type of game that you can kind of make it what you want it to be. If you want it to be kind of a military style strategy game, you can do that. If you want it to be about these kind of court relationships and, kind of backstabbing and whatnot, you could do that as well. And so I think that's the most exciting part of it. Because when you think about historical strategy games in, kind of the vein of Civilization or even Total War, they're kind of really funneling you down certain styles of play. Whereas, kind of the greatness of these Paradox games is about the sandboxy nature of these titles.
Yeah, and you're hugely reliant on stuff that's hard to change quickly. So, I mean, it's almost like a bit of a nod to the community that the tutorial is in Ireland. You start off in Munster, which is where I'm from, because in the previous game, the community had dubbed Ireland Tutorial Island, because it's just such a good place to start to play the game, because you're more or less being left alone and you've got a bit of time to build up. At the same time, although you can become very powerful, it's just kind of hard to do. So, for example, if you want to build, a stable, or if you want to build a building in your in one of your counties that will give you more archers, which is another actually part of CK3, which has become much more transparent as how armies work and things like that. That takes about 3 years in game to build that, and it costs about 200 gold, and especially early in the game, 200 gold is a lot of gold. Like I'm making about 8 gold a month, which is a good income, which is pretty healthy. So you can't just I have no quick way to ramp up Ireland's military capacity. But I could get there. And then the other side of it is I've just united the island of Ireland, and I'm hoping to just kind of chill. And if I want to, I could do that. And I know it doesn't sound terribly exciting maybe to listeners who've never played a Paradox game, but I could really work on Ireland's infrastructure over the next century. and my long-term goal is to create a Celtic alliance to eradicate the English. I mean, obviously, what else would I do? But you're right. You can just kind of hang out. And the one thing with Crusader Kings 3, I'm assuming, because Crusader Kings 2 was like this, it will kind of push the personal stuff on you. It kind of really wants you to at least be aware of it, and you'll have factions and stuff. But you don't have to dive fully into it. And what's interested me is the systems are pretty similar. And it's kind of amazing, as someone who isn't a game designer, to note how a UI change that theoretically is just a surface level change really impacts how the player interacts with this kind of stuff. So when you declare war in the last game, you had to click 2 or 3 times to get into your military screen and raise different kinds of levies. And it was good because it gave you a choice. I could raise these levies, but not those, yada, yada, yada. That guy's still upset with me. If I raise his army, he might rebel on me in the middle of the war, yada, yada, et cetera, et cetera. And in Crusader Kings 3, there's a raise all armies button. And it's silly because it saves you like maybe 3 seconds of your life. But the change in how you approach the game is just huge. Like it's actually kind of hard. It's kind of hard to explain, and they've done a couple of tweaks on how war actually works to make it a bit simpler, which I actually also think makes sense. They actually tell you why when you siege a territory it becomes crossed with these different kinds of lines, different colored lines, which they never explained to the previous game, just to figure out. So that's been really interesting because the same is true for the intrigue and stuff. Like starting a scheme is pretty easy, and now they have this lovely mechanic called hooks, which feels kind of very video gamey but works beautifully. So, for example, I won a war early in my game, and I imprisoned the guy's wife and son, because apparently that's what you do. And I decided I didn't want to have an 8-year-old in prison, so I decided I'd release him. And the game is like, well, if you want, you can have a hook on him. I'm like, oh, and a hook is something that you can use negotiating with that character. So to get higher taxes out of him, or to get him to come and help you in a war, but it depends on, there's different strengths of hooks and everything. And I like it because it gives you something that makes sense to you in your head later if you want to do a video game thing with this character later. But it also makes sense narratively, because if you were in my prison and I let you go and I didn't have to, it would make sense I would have, quote, a hook over you. And also, my spy master discovered that one of my vassals who doesn't like me is having an affair with the crazy atheist lunatic who hangs out in our court for some reason. And if I want to, I can expose him to get him in trouble, or I can reach out to him privately and say, wouldn't it be terrible if I told your wife and all the other vassals that you're having an affair with an atheist? And so it's such a clever little thing, this hook. And that's kind of the most in your face example of how they've kind of evolved some of those things. But I think that idea, I think they just went into the game to say, how can we make this less opaque to people? And that seems to have spawned lots of cool ideas on its own.
Yeah, and I think that is a worthwhile endeavor. I mean, I would assume that there are probably many players, hardcore Paradox fans who are like, they didn't change the game enough, and this is just kind of more CK. But at the same time, those kinds of UI issues, those kinds of issues with opaqueness were what turned me off of CK2. And so I would say that iterating on those and improving those, that's a worthwhile endeavor, because you're going to get players who come in and look at the game completely differently from the Ragnar's, and maybe enliven the kind of community around the game. And, you compare this to new iterations of other strategy games, kind of the most famous one is Civilization, but Total War is kind of like this as well. How much they really changed in the game, with each iteration. It's not that much, right? It's just kind of fresh coat of paint, improvements on UI. And so I would say that, if there were people out there who are complaining about this just being more CK, it kind of fits in part and parcel with the rest of, new strategy games. It's not that much different. And at least for me, it sounds really exciting because of those small improvements.
And some of them are so subtle. I'm just thinking now as we're talking, this is a classic Paradox game thing where you can change the speed at which time is passing. And even the little kind of graphic, flair they put on that little thing, it's just a more welcoming game in that sense. And it unleashes in many ways the strengths of Crusader Kings 2 and 3. Because a lot of people will talk to you, and I've certainly talked in this podcast before about it's such an interesting kind of narrative kind of game. But really bringing home to me this past week of, so for those who've never played one of these games, you're going through, obviously not real time, but you'll go through day by day. There's a moving calendar in the bottom of your screen, and at the slowest setting, it takes a few seconds for a day to pass. Mm-hmm. So it really takes quite a while, and it takes your army X amount of days to get from one place to the other, et cetera, et cetera. But because you're focused on your character and then his or her offspring and everything else, so my character, everything kind of got settled. People were respecting him. So he went to Rome on a pilgrimage to just get some piety, a very video gamey thing. Piety is a currency in the game. But that's how life works. If someone's alive for 50 years, they're not full-on lunatics the entire 50 years most of the time. I mean, some of them are. Like, they're doing different kinds of things. So different things have happened in the kingdom, and this is the huge strength of the Crusader Kings games, is the sense of, obviously these are made up characters and sometimes they do rather kind of crazy things, but that human beings are complex and deeply arbitrary, and whether we like it or not, the medieval period can become perhaps a cliched shorthand for this, but whether we like it or not, human individual decisions just have these massive impacts on what happens.
Yeah.
And that's the case in CK3, and it comes to the fore very clearly, and it's a lot of fun to play with.
Yeah. And I think it's useful for, representing a version of the past. And I also think in terms of just game mechanics, you think about how compelling role-playing games have been since forever in gaming, analog gaming, digital gaming. And this really brings in that kind of aspect, as, taking on a role, taking on a different persona. And I think it's, it's just a huge breath of fresh air for strategy games, because it's kind of one of those ideas that was always kind of latent in strategy games. When you think about playing a game of Civilization, you could, I'm pretending to be Queen Elizabeth or Shaka Zulu or something like that. But, your character never really had any personality or intrigue along with it, unless it existed in your mind. And I do know people who used to play Civilization while holding on to a replica sword, like really getting into the idea of being a world leader. But here with the Paradox games, in CK in particular, they've really leaned into that. And I think you're going to see that popping up more and more often. We already talked recently about Old World and how that game has a little bit of this kind of extra RPG, extra narrative elements added in to the leader of your civilization or your country, what have you. And I would not be surprised at all if Firaxis in their next iteration, Civilization, kind of lean into the idea of expanding the role of leaders, inspired partly by Paradox. So I think it's a great development in terms of, what we talk about, historical representation in games, but it's also a great development just for playing games, just in terms of game mechanics.
Yeah, the Old World, Humankind is coming out, which I've played a little bit beta stuff. And of course, the most recent Total War games, they're all kind of leaning into these character ideas. I mean, before we leave CK3 as well, I'll say it's speaking of representation, it's just so interesting. CK3 is a particular type of a game that Civ couldn't really emulate all the way, because it's just, we're going to build these super complex systems and let you do what you're going to do. At the moment in my game, the first game I played was CK3, my granddaughter is the heir to the kingdom. I've united Ireland, and so she is going to, and it's done through tanistry, so it's basically, we're all voting. And she's the leader in the votes, although it's kind of fluctuated, basically because everyone thinks that my character is awesome because he's 55 and he united Ireland. So like he's just, 55 in the year 1050. He's been around forever as far as they're concerned. And so through my character's sheer authority, and she's only just turned 18, she's going to be she's going to be Queen of Ireland. hopefully, because I don't want the other guy to take over. She's not going to get any of my other titles, in part because she's a woman, and I can go in and I can change. I have enough prestige, which is another currency. I could change rules to make sure that women aren't eligible for the Kingdom of Ireland. I could do that now, and because I know that when she becomes queen, there'll be these penalties against her. She's too young. She's only been the ruler for a few months, etc., etc. But there will be, I'm assuming, because CK2 had this, a penalty from all the men, all the vassals, that she's a woman, and some of them at least will have that penalty. And I mean, that sucks, but that's also pretty accurate to what, like medieval rulers, certainly in Western Europe, were like. Yeah. But because it's just so grounded in, especially the further you get under the hood, what's a very complex model, it makes sense, I think. And so you're getting away. So, for example, in a Call of Duty game where someone's like, oh, this is nonsense, there weren't women or whatever, but you don't mind the guy with the minigun on the back of a camel running around the desert, but suddenly you care about verisimilitude when it comes to the gender of the combatants and stuff. This Crusader Kings games, I think, are different because the system is there. And at least so far, my granddaughter is going to be the queen. And so the game is giving me ways that, you can get around it. Mm-hmm. In the way that you can get on lots of things in the game. So I think I like that because there's no, how do I put it? All they're really doing is trying to be true to the sense of creating an open narrative sandbox to kind of recreate historical scenarios. But in so doing, I think they are doing representation a solid.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they're leaving that door open, which I think is great.
Yeah. So we are planning on doing a live stream of this game at some point?
Yeah. We hopefully lots of fun things will happen, diseases and trips to Rome. We'll figure it out. We'll do it. But I think maybe we have a video coming out this week on the channel, so maybe we'll do the stream perhaps next week for people who are interested.
Yeah.
Definitely worth a look. Well, it's not, although it's the only history video game news that mattered this week from my perspective. It's not the only. There's a few historical tales, historical settings moving around. Let's jump forward a little bit chronologically to World War II, and then after that, the Cold War. Bob, you've been keeping a bit better track of this stuff than I have. Let's talk about this new Medal of Honor game first. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so World War II has been on my mind quite a bit. We're in the midst of remembering the 75th anniversary of the end of the war this week. And so there is a new World War II video game coming out, unsurprisingly, a first-person shooter. And it is being made by Respawn. And these are the makers of the Titanfall series. And then also, I think, Apex, right? Am I right in thinking Apex is Respawn as well?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, so they've got a team that have been working in the last few years on a VR first-person World War II game. And it is part of the Medal of Honor series. Now, for those listeners who don't remember, the Medal of Honor series is one that debuted way back, I think in 1999 or 2000. On the PlayStation, and it is a series that was mostly inspired by kind of the World War II movies, documentaries that were coming out in the late 90s. I want to say, too, that the Medal of Honor series had some early production advice from Steven Spielberg and his production company. And so this is a game that was initially designed partly to, sell copies, obviously, but then also to kind of work on this idea of remembering the war and popularizing the memory of the war for video game players. So Spielberg, as many of you know, was really big into this kind of movement with Tom Hanks through Saving Private Ryan, but then also the TV miniseries Band of Brothers. And so Medal of Honor was kind of a multimedia part of that kind of project. And so the early titles really kind of what you would expect from a first-person World War II game, bombastic, cinematic, focused on the American experience in the war. And this new VR title from Respawn called Medal of Honor Above and Beyond fits into that mold like a glove. I mean, it was watching the trailer, which you can find online. It was really like stepping back in time to the early 2000s, to my late teenage years, and the kind of games and the kind of narratives that I experienced there. You've got your soldier who's dealing with the OSS, it looks like, so the Office of Strategic Services. You're an agent, and you're working with, everyday soldiers, but then you're also working with members of the French Resistance and members of British intelligence. And it is really a lot like the first couple of Medal of Honor games, which fit that mold to a T. And I'm really fascinated to see how this game is received, 20 years after the first Medal of Honor game came out, because, I think that kind of bombastic, gung-ho view of World War II very much fit the mood of the late 1990s, early 2000s. But I wonder now in the 2020s, if that same sort of perspective is going to be as eagerly gobbled up by players as it was back then.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're making me feel old now, Bob. But I
got bad news for you, John.
I know. And with COVID and everything, it's just interesting because it just feels like such a weird, low-profile anniversary of the largest scale conflict in human history, or certainly in recent human history. And so it's theoretically video games can fill the void. I never know. I also don't know, like the VR space makes it interesting too, because it automatically limits the audience. And we'll know more when it comes out. But when you mentioned the OSS, I was thinking, well, there's the DEER team, there's the OSS team that went into Vietnam and worked with Ho Chi Minh against the Japanese. Like if they wanted to for a sequel, there's places they could go. But yeah, I'd also be kind of curious. Also, Medal of Honor was a shooter when kind of all you had to do to be a shooter was, well, the expectations were different, I guess we could put it that way.
Yeah.
And it was pre-Halo, wasn't it?
Oh, it was pre-Halo.
Yeah.
I think some of the later titles came out contemporaneously with Halo. But, Halo fundamentally changed the way that shooters were developed for consoles, and Medal of Honor was very much an old style console first-person shooter, and severely limited in terms of visuals, severely limited in terms of level design and level space. But I mean, I would say, 15, 16-year-old Bob had a really great time with these games. And I was very much one who was inspired by The Greatest Generation, inspired by these tales of individual daring, collective daring during the Second World War. And it's just fascinating to me now, having gone through so many years of studying history, studying the Second World War in particular, getting a PhD in history, now looking back on that period in those games and seeing the ways that it was attempting to, build a memory for the war among my generation. And now I look at it with a much more critical eye, and I'm wondering, is this same sort of shtick going to work in the 2020s? I mean, it certainly won't have much of an impact on me, but for younger players, and, again, the audience is a little bit limited because of it being on VR. I don't know how many headsets are really out there, and it's debuting first on the Oculus Store. But, it is interesting to me to think about, how the memory of the war is going to continue, how games in the future are going to continue to add to that memory. And it just seems odd that this game, made by a really good developer, I love Respawn, but this game that is a new game is still, it feels so old in a sense, even though it's on VR, even though it's made with modern technology. The kind of direction and the feel of the trailer on the narrative makes it just feel like a throwback to the late 90s, early 2000s.
And I wonder as well, like, would the VR audience be older and a bit better off or something? Because I'm just thinking of, the people that we teach, or at least the quote unquote traditional college age, right? It's like, obviously lots of different people go to college, but like let's just say taking 20-year-olds, like you say, Bob, they haven't grown up with the Greatest Generation kind of mythos in the way that you and I have. I think George H.W. Bush was the last American president who had served in the military. Is that right? But before him... Well,
George W. Bush claims that he served in the Air Force National Guard.
Because Obama was too young, but Clinton, W, and Trump all found ways to not be
Hmm.
to not go and serve. But I think up to HW from World War II on, of course, I mean Eisenhower was a general for God's sake. There was this thing in American politics, and with McCain passing a couple of years ago, I remember reading a lot of commentary about that, how the kind of the military background is just not as common as it once was.
Yeah.
And so it's just intriguing to me, like one of the bigger military related stories the last 2 weeks in video game news has been concern over the American military effectively kind of marketing itself on Twitch
Yeah.
and other platforms. And there's kind of been a skepticism there. And I don't think it's just a quote unquote, and I'm not using this as pejorative, woke kind of video game commentators. I don't think it's just that. I think there's a genuine kind of wave of unease about that.
Yeah.
So where does a classic Medal of Honor view? Is it kind of like a Madden thing where like if it's fun, nobody cares? I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and you could see this kind of game, even though it's historical, you could see it fitting in that maybe same narrative of promoting the U.S. military, promoting the U.S. Army. It's not the U.S. Army playing games on Twitch or buying ad space on a major gaming website, but because your character is an American soldier, because they're involved with the OSS and fighting in the Second World War, it is kind of indirectly promoting that bureaucracy. It's promoting that army. So, I'm really fascinated to see it. I don't know if I'll be able to play it. I think your point about maybe the audience for this game being older is a good one because of the expense associated with VR headsets. I don't know about you, but I haven't bought one yet. So, I don't know if I'll be inspired.
You think we'd be the target market?
I know exactly. Yeah. I don't know if I'd be inspired by this game to get one either. So I would certainly have quite a few issues with buying one from Oculus because of the close relationship with Facebook. But I don't know. I would like to play it at some point, or maybe at least watch it on Twitch or YouTube.
Yeah, and one last thing on VR. I mean, we've joked at this before, but I mean, in the education space, I'll talk about education, technology, and obviously I'll talk about video games. And the one thing that always gets traction is VR, because I think that there's somebody, I'm sure the audience loves to hear this. So deans and other college administrators read these publications that are produced just for them. And I think they have like VR articles once a month or something. Uh-huh. So you have all these people who, they know what Super Mario is, and they also are under the impression that a professor can build like, Normandy in a VR space in a week if they're given the time. So Medal of Honor could find some traction there. It could, you could find a donor to set you up with a special lab where college students can these young people can learn what it was really like or whatever. Which is another interesting level. Well, speaking of narratives and everything else, I've seen I don't know much about the next Call of Duty Black Ops game, but there have been a lot of Reagan-centric, somewhat skeptical jokes in my social media feed. Bob, do you know much about this next Call of Duty Black Ops game?
Yeah, so we've got a new Call of Duty game coming out, Black Ops title, and this title, which is coming out in November, I don't know if they've got a firm date yet, but this one is going back to the Cold War. So if you'll remember, the first two Black Ops games were centered around Cold War history. First game was kind of early Cold War, 1950s, going through to Vietnam. And then the second game had this weird structure where it was modern day elements, but then also elements back in the past during the kind of later stages of the Cold War in the 70s and the 80s. And this game... Oh, and I should say that, Black Ops 3, Black Ops 4 went into kind of weird, modern, alternate history. It didn't really involve the Cold War. This game, Black Ops Cold War, is going back to the Cold War, as you could probably guess from the title of the game. And this one is going to be centered on the 1980s. And in the cinematic trailer for the game, one of the characters that gets introduced is Ronald Reagan, old Ronnie Reagan. The so-called great communicator steps in with the kind of known characters of the game. You've got, what's his name? Let me look at this. I'm going to look at the website here. I don't know, but they've got the Black Ops characters, the guy that Ed Harris used to voice in Black Ops 1 and Black Ops 2. They're back. And now they're in a meeting with Ronald Reagan discussing a new covert mission that they're going to be a part of. And so this trailer and the previous launch trailer for the game have been criticized, firstly for the presence of Ronald Reagan, who many people associate with, when it comes to covert ops, associate with the Iran-Contra affair, associate with, various CIA activities in Latin America and in the developing world during the 1980s. And so many people have been criticizing this game for kind of promoting this person that they associate with war crimes, essentially. But my perspective is, that criticism is fine, but at the same time, like, this is what Black Ops has been doing since it started, right? I mean, you had the first game had you participating in an attempted assassination on Fidel Castro. JFK was in that game, and let's not forget the type of activities that the U.S. government was up to when JFK was an audience. His hands are definitely not clean, especially when it comes to Vietnam, when it comes to Cuba and elsewhere.
Right.
And then Black Ops 2 has got even more controversial elements. Oliver North, who was directly involved in the Iran-Contra affair, selling weapons to Iran to support the Contras in Nicaragua, he was not only in the game as a character, as an NPC, but also was an advisor to Black Ops 2. And if you go back, Black Ops 2, I think, came out about 8 years ago, something like that. If you go back and watch the kind of promotional material, marketing material for that game, Oliver North is, kind of one of these historical experts that they interview while they intersperse it with game footage, right?
Right.
And furthermore, you've got, as we talked about in the HR episode for Black Ops 1, Black Ops 2, you've got other war criminals like Joseph Savimbi in that game. Noriega is in that game. I mean, this is what Black Ops does, right? And so
right.
I would say that I can accept criticism of Reagan being in it, but it's like, where were y'all when, Oliver North was in the game? Where were y'all when we were, having missions with Noriega, with Savimbi? I mean, where was the controversy then?
I know. I mean, yeah, my first reaction is kind of like, I mean, obviously Reagan isn't above criticism. There's no question there, but I kind of feel Reagan gets reduced to very simple depictions on both sides of the political aisle kind of thing. But and it's not just like, the same way Oliver North's been on like TV for the last few years. It's like, but it's Oliver North. Like I'm very much against kind of present day kind of dictums dictating how we treat historical figures, but it's Oliver North, like this guy, yes, he got, limited immunity or whatever for effectively kind of, sharing the ways he broke the law, but not a great guy here.
Well, and Reagan essentially got off the hook for Iran-Contra because they thought, oh, well, he's so old that he didn't really know what was going on. And, the response to that would be, if he's so old and doesn't know what he's going on, why is he president of the United States of America? But that's a whole other issue. There's a whole other argument.
Just you Phil Hartman, Ronald Reagan, and it'll cover everything if you don't know what I'm talking about. That's classic.
But I would say that this controversy, particularly with regards to Reagan in this game, it kind of shows you, I think, how the culture around games, the coverage of games have changed in the last decade. I would say and I don't want to generalize too much because I'm sure there was criticism at the time, but when Black Ops 2 came out and it featured Oliver North, I don't remember this kind of uproar. But now with Reagan being included, this kind of idea of what we were talking about with World War II, valorizing American activities abroad, illegal activities by the CIA in manipulating foreign countries and attacking foreign countries through information warfare, through covert operations. That kind of history and that kind of game is now a point for criticism. And I don't think you would have seen that when Black Ops 2, Black Ops 1 was coming out. It would just been kind of like, oh, this is the next game, right? But now I
Right.
think there's kind of a general awareness that these games portray real history, and that historical portrayal might have an influence on what people think about that past.
Yeah, and it's, I know there's people out there going, but everything is, or the classic Ubisoft gets dinged a lot for our game isn't political, and they often deserve to get dinged. But this is kind of this is getting intriguing, and Bob, you and I were children when the Iran Contra thing happened, but we kind of woke up, or we kind of grew up with maybe parents talking about it, or just it being, it not being that far away, and kind of having a sense of the outline of it. And then, how our parents felt about it kind of really helped shape how we felt about it. But again, and I know that I know video games are not aimed primarily, well, sometimes they are primarily at 20-year-olds, but I know there's a very wide market of games across ages and all of the demographics. But there's definitely a core demographic where this is it. This is how they're being introduced to it. So, how do we feel about that? And as you say, that's where Oliver North coming into it is problematic. And I've read some other things about the game. I think there was a trailer for the game that worried some people pretty significantly. It kind of had a strange take on the history of the period.
Yes, so there's a good article up on Kotaku about this, and it is about Call of Duty's Cold War, or Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, their debut trailer. And the Kotaku article is Call of Duty trailer recklessly promotes far-right conspiracy theory. So the conspiracy theory involved includes footage that Activision has included in this trailer. Includes footage of an interview on a kind of a conspiracy television show back in the 1980s featuring Soviet defector Yuri Bezmenov. And Bezmenov and his ilk were famous for discussing active measures, basically information warfare, psychological warfare against the United States practiced by the Soviet Union. And Bezmenov's suggestion was that, the efforts to extend equality in the United States, essentially the civil rights movement, provided an avenue for the Soviet Union to create discord, political, economic, and cultural discord within the United States. And so essentially the argument of conspiracy theorists back then was that we should avoid the civil rights movement. We should avoid extending equality and worrying too much about equality because it makes us weak against the Soviet Union. So this is the kind of this is the interview that's presented without context in the trailer for this new game. And now, stepping back for a moment and looking at historical games more generally, this is a pretty common tactic for developers and narrative designers for historical games, in the sense that they like to set games in the kind of cracks within the historical narrative. In other words, they like to find a point of controversy. They like to find compelling conspiracy theory or persistent conspiracy theory, and then fill in the game narrative into that crack in the historical narrative. But here's a moment where we have an out-and-out, screwball conspiracy theory, one that was very popular in the 1980s, 1990s, but one that has no merit whatsoever. And so to have a game, take that tact and to present it in a trailer is really disturbing. And, I would like to hold judgment until the final game comes out, and, certain elements of the game might even be changed up until, November when the game is released. But it is one of these disturbing moments where, you can see the perspective of the developers wanting to find a really interesting take on the Cold War and use that as the basis for their game. But to do so in kind of this haphazard, slapdash way in which you're promoting a conspiracy theory that is, racist in its perspective is really, it's not great. It's not a good look. It's not what you want.
And I think it does play into one of the great fears that I have of conspiracy theories more broadly, which is, I think one of the appeals of conspiracy theories, and sometimes just flat out like bad historical takes, is, you see, it's always been taught this way, but it was actually this,
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, that's actually the fun part of history when you're doing it properly, which is, well, it's true that you might have learned this in school, but look, read these sources or read these books, and you might still think what you thought when you were 16, but you'll be exposed to more ways of looking at it. Like the American Revolution is a very good example of that, right? There's nothing wrong with seeing it as this entirely kind of glorious moment in history and the birth of nations, so on and so on. But there's a lot more stuff you can kind of learn of it. I think of another example is the Irish slaves lie, which is the idea, well, there were Irish slaves too. No, there weren't. There just weren't. And there's a few reasons that particular lie is popular, and some of them are very not okay. They're racist.
Yeah.
But I think there's this core idea of like, but this is the real, this is the real stuff here,
Yeah.
and
what your teacher doesn't want you to know.
Yeah, and part of our job is like, you can do that by going into this thing called a library, the truth.info.x is not like a random website is not a reliable source for this stuff. So that's concerning. And so seeing it come into like, don't forget these quote unquote AAA games, massive amounts of money are invested in this, person hours are invested in this game. That's, they should do a bit better. It's not okay. Considering all the ways they could, as you say, Bob, they could find their little spaces in between the lines without going to those dark places.
I think so.
Totally doable.
I think so. Yeah. Totally agree.
Well, so speaking of kind of bending things, we were going to talk about a couple of things that are coming up soon. Iron Harvest came out, which I haven't got my hands on yet, Bob. I think we're both going to get that game, which is basically mechs in an interwar period. I'm not sure if the war stopped or not, but it's an alternate take on 1920s Western Europe / Central Eastern Europe, I think, right?
Yes, yeah. And so this is a real-time strategy game that's come out, and I'm fascinated to play it. I'm kind of in the next decade or so, if I live that long, obviously, but I'm really curious to see how the interwar period is depicted by video games. We've seen already, of course, starting with games like Medal of Honor, the ways in which Second World War is adapted. We've seen more recently in this past decade how the First World War has been adapted by games. And now I think we're going to get a whole slew of new titles that adapt interwar history. And I think Iron Harvest fits into that. I think the new game from the Romeros, Empire of Sin, about gangsters and the interwar period during Prohibition, I think that fits into that as well. And so I'm really curious to play Iron Harvest, not only for its game mechanics. I'm curious to play what an RTS looks like in 2020, but also I'm curious about its ideas about alternate histories, alternate takes on the interwar period. And, it seems like it kind of fits in part and parcel with, other alternate histories that have been portrayed by different mods. You can think of Hearts of Iron mods that look at, what if, the First World War just kept going, for instance, or,
right.
What if there had never been the rise of Nazi Germany, that kind of thing. And you see that playing out in a lot of different modifications, primarily for Hearts of Iron, but then for other games as well. And so I think that this game kind of fits into that alternate history world, one that's really popular with modding communities. And so I'm curious to see what a game, a game that's focused on those kinds of alternate histories. What does that look like?
And Bob, just briefly, what do you think the potential is there? Because interwar period's kind of your home field.
It is. I'm very excited.
I'm deliberately going to be overly general here, but I feel like in my high school experience a long time ago, it was like, well, in the 1920s, everyone was drinking and having fun and having illicit fun if possible. In the 1930s, everything went wrong, which is, obviously I'm being a little bit facetious, but not that much more facetious than my history textbook was.
Yeah.
What are potential areas, or how would you like to see the interwar period get explored in a different way and some of this new media coming out?
Well, I think one of the most difficult things with the interwar period when you're writing about it, when you're teaching it, is to get over this idea, this kind of established narrative that you mentioned, where you've got a moment of tranquility and peace in the 1920s, and then the 1930s everything is just a sliding slope down to the Second World War. And I think that does a disservice to interwar history, because you definitely got moments in the 1930s that show a possibility for a different past, a different future that could have been for Europe and for the rest of the world. Then also, I think that the traditional perspective on the 1920s is kind of this period where, like you said, everybody's having a good time and getting drunk, is also misrepresenting that past. You can think kind of the worldwide Red Scare in Europe and, the colonial world, the United States as well, during the immediate post-war period. Very serious violence, very serious repression of politics, of social norms, of left-leaning political groups. And that kind of activity continues on into the 1920s. For the stuff that I study, policing, international policing, you've got a worldwide movement to basically eradicate labor leaders, to suppress labor groups, to suppress left-leaning political groups. You've got the rise of J. Edgar Hoover, the Palmer raids in the United States. To call the interwar period, to call the 1920s in particular, this kind of rosy period of brief harmony before destruction, I think is misrepresenting it. So I'm curious to see if games get into that at all. I mean, I know that that's kind of a little bit more of a sophisticated perspective, because I'm a PhD, but I do think that there's opportunities, without getting involved in conspiracy theories, there's opportunities to tell histories of this time period that are more nuanced and I think more interesting potentially for game players than, what you could do with just the static narrative history that you get in most textbooks.
Right. No, definitely. And I'm thinking, Iron Harvest has the steampunk aesthetic and idea, and steampunk aficionados listening might correct me, but I always associate that with a kind of a late 19th century, usually alternate history. So it's kind of intriguing to me because it's this built-in kind of way or a built-in viewpoint that instead of looking forward to 1939/1937, 41, whichever year your country considers World War II to have begun, it's looking backwards, which makes sense, like you say, like the kind of reacting to labor rights is very much a continuation of the struggles of the 1850s on, so.
Yeah.
And,
awesome. With regards to the steampunk element, and I think you're right to point this out, is that those elements, this kind of ideas about where the future was leading, from the late 19th century, there were many Europeans at the time who assumed that there were going to be large mechanical machines like this. And, for my undergraduate thesis, I studied British fears of invasion during the late 19th century and the lead up to the First World War. And there's this whole, field of cultural history that looks at, British sci-fi novels during the late 19th century, stuff like H.G. Wells, where they're worried about, the French or the Germans creating these super machines that can devastate the English defenses, can eliminate the English fleet in the English Channel, and then overwhelm England's defenses at home. And that is essentially, the kind of most famous example of this is H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, which is, extraterrestrial invasion, but again, mechanical creatures, mechanized, tanks on large legs and whatnot. And that kind of perspective, the idea behind that came out of this late 19th century period, this concern with invasion, not necessarily of extraterrestrials, but of other European powers. So
right.
All this stuff, this particular version of steampunk that you see in Iron Harvest, this is new, but the idea would have fit in well in, kind of general fears, sci-fi fears from that time period, from the late 19th century going forward.
Right. And also World War I didn't end imperialism, which is kind of sometimes taught that way. But so we have a lot to talk about. So we're hopefully have some good coverage on Iron Harvest. And I think we're going to wrap up soon, but you've got a couple more cool things to talk about, Bob. You have the next Inkle game, and then a book that I'm excited about. Which do you want to go for first?
Yeah, let's talk about Inkle. So Inkle Studios, developers of 80 Days, developers of Heaven's Vault. Heaven's Vault, we had a good episode on that, I think last year. And
Hmm.
so they're a studio that should be familiar to you if you are into historical games. And they've got a new game called Pendragon coming out at the end of this month. And this is a game that's going to be set basically in England, and you're going to be playing out the legend of King Arthur, Arthurian legends in the 7th century. And the game has got an interesting structure. I haven't played it yet, but they're touting it as a narrative strategy game, and in a sense, you are playing out the strategy element and the ways in which you adapt to the strategy, the ways in which your battles, your tactics play out. That determines where the narrative goes, and so this kind of fits in with Inkle's past development. This is kind of a part of 80 Days, which is
Right.
essentially a very dressed up choose your own adventure game. And then Heaven's Vault also, that has a mechanic in it where you are responsible for translating, archaeological finds, language in that game. And the success that you have in translation determines on what narrative choices or what narrative options open up for you. So they've been working on this type of model of game for a long time, and I'm really interested in seeing what this means for Pendragon, for this Arthurian legend. And I'm really excited to cover it for History Respawn. I think it'll be a good game.
Yeah, I'm excited. They had those sorcery games on smartphones as well, which are also choose your own adventure. I just love the name of that game.
Yeah,
I don't know.
good name.
The fact they called it Pendragon, yeah, I'm like, yeah, that kind of, I don't know, that just bodes well for their creative choices. I think it's just not obvious, but not too obscure. It's good.
I think they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that at least for our audience, they are choosing titles. They are choosing kind of settings really well. Very clever. And then the book that you mentioned is Sid Meier's memoir, which is called Sid Meier's Memoir. And so Sid Meier, famously the developer of the Civilization series, particularly worked on Civilization 1, Civilization 2, and then kind of loaned his name and provided advice for the subsequent Civilization games. Also famous for all of the titles he produced at Microprose during the 80s and 90s, Sid Meier's Pirates, Covert Operations, or I think it's called Covert Operations. It's some spy game, Railroad Tycoon. Gosh, what else? There's dozens
SimCity?
of
Is SimCity Sid Meier?
No, that's
I
Will
always
Wright.
But yes, but you see, Sid Meier is so important. I get him mixed up with Will Wright, who's also huge.
Sid Meier's Gettysburg as well. Really
right.
famous strategy game from the early 90s. And so he's written a memoir. And, over the past, I would say, decade, Sid Meier and the other people who worked at Microprose, like Bruce Shelley, they've been out and about doing talks, doing interviews. They did a few things at GDC in the past few years where they kind of do retrospectives on their old games. Now we've got Sid Meier's actually publishing a book, a memoir. And so I'm really interested in digging into it because I think we still, even though, video games have been around for a long time, we still don't have much in the way of firsthand perspectives on the history of games. We have a lot of people talking about the ephemera of games, talking about the marketing of games, talking about games that are published and analyzing those. But as far as talking to developers and talking to them about older titles, we still, you would be surprised, listener, by how little we actually have in the way of memoirs or diaries or journals related to game development. So to get one of those titles is a great joy, but to get one from Sid Meier, I think is really important for people interested in historical games because, so many of his titles are foundational to the historical games we play today. So I got an advanced copy of the game, or of not the game. I wish it was a game. I got an advanced copy of the memoirs, so I'm looking forward to digging into that this weekend and then hopefully writing a review, either History Respawn or somewhere else coming up. So yeah, excited about that.
That's great, and it's such a great point that I just wish you had more of this stuff. Like if someone had asked me 10 years ago, what's a good book to read about that talks about the development of a game, I would have said, oh, you have to read Masters of Doom, which is about Doom and is really good. And if you asked me today, I would say you should probably read Masters of Doom. Like there's nothing, there have been a couple in the last decade and a half, but it's slow going. And I got two of the most famous designers mixed up. Will Wright has done one of those masterclass videos, those things they advertise on Facebook to people with 20-year-old children. So you could give us hundreds of dollars, and your son or daughter can watch a few Dead Mouse videos on how to be a DJ. Will Wright has one of those.
I didn't know that.
Design.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen it. I think I would like to see it, but it's kind of intriguing because, as you just said, from our interest, it's like, oh, I'm assuming he will talk about The Sims and SimCity and other things that he's done. So I can't wait to hear about Memoir, and I'll probably read it myself. So that's great. That's awesome. So I think everyone knows I've been playing Crusader Kings III, playing a bunch of Crusader Kings III, and that's kind of where I am. How about you, Bobby? Before we go, are you playing anything fun?
Yeah, I've been playing the God of War game. I think I mentioned this on the last podcast. The most recent God of War game that came out, I think, a few years ago now, for PlayStation 4. And like I mentioned last time, this is the first God of War game that I played. When God of War came out originally on PlayStation 2 and then PlayStation 3, I was in a period where I wasn't playing games. I was an undergrad. I was a master's student, and I was not really paying attention to games or doing any of that stuff. But I decided to pick up this one because I thought, it might be interesting to look at it for History Respawn. There's a lot of, as you probably know, historical mythology. God of War, the original series 1 through 3 focuses on Greek mythology. And then this game, the new God of War, has the same main character Kratos, from Greece, now in kind of a ancient version of Scandinavia. All right, interacting with the gods and demigods of Norse mythology, and it's a game though that I think is just not for me. I think the historical elements, the kind of narrative touches with the ways in which they adapt the history of Norse mythology, the ways in which they use runes as part of a narrative element, a gameplay element. I think that's super interesting, but the moment-to-moment gameplay, the third-person action of these games is just really boring to me, and I don't think I'm going to make it all the way through. And that's not to say the game isn't well made. It's incredibly well made. It's really beautiful. It shows up well on the PlayStation 4, but I just don't find the gameplay that interesting, and the combat is just kind of not compelling to me. And and that's just me speaking. I'm not saying that kind of combat is bad in general, but it's just something I don't find that interesting, and it makes me realize, well, I don't think I would have enjoyed God of War if I had played it even back in the 2000s. Now, maybe, these kind of third-person action games are for young people. Maybe they're more compelling to people who don't have a long history of playing beat-em-ups. But for me, it's just kind of like, this is an old style of game with a lot of new window dressing. Yeah.
It's funny you say that, because I've got to the point where my video game time is so precious because there's so little of it.
Yeah.
My patience is just gone, and I just can't hang out and play games. But it reminds me of the third Dragon Age game, which there are people who love that game with a passion I cannot do justice to using the English language. Like, they love that game. And it's not exactly a white whale, but I've tried so hard to like that game because I loved the first game. And the second game, and I one day I realized I loved the first game. I remember being on a research trip in Washington, D.C. and leaving the archive early to go back to my hotel room to play Dragon Age Origins. There's a confession right there. When I should have been working, I was playing Dragon Age Origins. And I just don't like the way that the third Dragon Age game plays.
Inquisition,
thank you. I just don't like the way it plays. And I've heard so many good things about it. Like, people love that game and the story it tells, and I just can't get there.
Yeah. And I'm one of those people who enjoyed Inquisition quite a bit when it came out. I don't know if I could replay it now. I think that game style kind of belongs to a different era, but I could totally see that criticism. I think your criticism is absolutely valid. It's that style of game, the way that they approached it, is definitely not for everybody. And I think that's the same story with God of War. Unfortunately, as I know that it won all sorts of Game of the Year awards. Lots of journalists, that's their favorite game. Lots of players, that's their favorite game. But for me, I just think that the combat, the moment-to-moment action in that game is just, it's not very compelling. It's just, it's not for me.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I had maybe I'll have further comments later in the year, but I was actually in the beta. I do have a watch you've been playing. I was in the beta for Amazon's new MMO, New World, which is kind of an interesting, like, themes of colonization of a new world, but with ghosts, I guess. I don't know.
Well, that's complicating.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. It might work out. It's they're really on the kind of fantasy side of it, but they're doing this thing a lot of MMOs try to do, which is they're trying to spice up the action. And it just and in fairness, I must be very clear, the game is in beta, so there's a lot of stuff.
Sure.
But it's like Dark Souls combat except bad. Not very enjoyable. And I'm just clicking my mouse button a lot and nothing. I'm like, you could have just given me a spell bar like I have in World of Warcraft or something.
Yeah.
And so it's a similar thing where if that game were to emerge as a really compelling, and especially the kind of game that we should cover in History Respawn, I'd be very sad if the gameplay was a barrier to that, because there's just that's obviously a key experience in games is playing them. So there's not getting past that.
No, I can't believe it. I think it is funny though that we have gotten to a point, and we've been here for a while. I think with History Respawn, we've gotten to a point where there are so many history games. There's so many games tinged with historical perspective, like New World, that we just don't have time to play them all. And it just goes to show you how important this genre of game, games with historical elements, games representing the past, how important that is for games in the game industry in general, right? This is not just like some sort of niche topic. This is front and center when it comes to major releases, especially for this fall. I mean, we've been talking about kind of smaller games, and I would kind of lump Paradox games into that. This is a game that'll be super popular with hardcore gamers, but maybe not with general audiences. But then you've got a new Assassin's Creed, a new Call of Duty coming up, which are historical games. And those are going to be played by millions and millions and millions of people. So right through every part of the gaming industry, whether it's a small indie title, whether it's kind of a mid-budget game, or whether it's a AAA release. I mean, this is gaming. It's history.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great place to leave it.
Yeah,
I agree. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for listening. If you don't know where to find us, you can go to historyrespawn.com. You can find History Respawn on YouTube. And of course, we hope that you enjoyed the podcast. If you're not a subscriber, you consider subscribing. You can always visit patreon.com/historyrespawn to support our work. We certainly appreciate it. And we're just grateful you gave us some of your time. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.